Hello to everyone. My name is Maria Glova-Jashevili. I'm very pleased on behalf of my trade union Renouveau Démocratie to welcome you at our webinar on Brexit issues with Alex Taylor as our special guest. I would like to thank Alex for having accepted our invitation. This meeting will be held in English and French and moderated by Blandine Pellistrandi, who is my colleague, and myself. And you will be also able to send the questions, if you have any, through the Slido. This is a special application that our host, Albi, will send via chat to you. So you can send a question. And if you see that this question have already been put, so then you can just click on like, and then we will therefore choose the most popular questions and transfer it to Alex in order to answer. Now I would like to invite Blandine, who is going to introduce Alex to you. Blandine, the floor is yours.
Just to be the most professional for the question, there is an application, and
yes.
let Hobby explain how it works.
Yeah, how it works is this Slido application. So you have to open it and to put your name if you want. If not, if don't, you don't just put the question as anonymous questions.
Okay, thank you, Maya. So welcome to everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with you for this first webinar, R&D webinar of the year. And I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Alex Taylor. So Alex, you were born in 1957, and this is an important year because it was the year of the Treaty of Rome. And we will see that along your life, European affairs have been the heart of your life. So you were born in 1957, and you discovered France and Europe, the continent, rather early with your father. You spent many holidays in campings and traveling through France, Belgium. When you were a teenager, your country joined the common market. At that time, UK was in a very delicate economic and social state. It was the ill man of the continent and near economic and social collapse. You studied French and German in the Oxford University. In fact, you fall in love with languages, and you developed a real passion for languages. And then, after you studied, you decided to join France for professional and above all for personal reasons. We translated with transforming professional also grounds. And you did it well before the Erasmus program. You literally fall in love with France, and you started your career as journalist, first at Fréquence Gay, the first gay radio station in the world, funded by a government. And you write in your book that Europe is for you not so much an intellectual project, but a matter of her heart. You are really a European journalist. You have spent your whole professional life talking about Europe in many medias, in France, Germany, Belgium, on Arte, Euronews, BFM, LCI, France Inter, Radio France Internationale, just to quote some channels. In the
excuse me, Blandine, it's hard to hear you. I don't know if anybody else is hearing the same interference, but there seems to be a lot of background noise, which is preventing us from hearing everything you're saying.
Blandine, it's maybe your audio somewhere there's a problem. Could you say something now?
Yes, so let us try. So in the 80s, you produced TV programs, just to mention Continental.
Blandine, do you have a headset?
I will I will put them, but in that case, I think I will be disconnect and I have to reconnect, probably, just to try.
Can you hear me?
Yes, much better now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so you produced some programs, Continental on the France 3 or the European show on Arte, Confetti. And I remember particularly your press reviews on France Inter. I must say that I was really a fan of your press review. Your way of summarizing the European news and the way you use words, it's really amazing. I really liked it. You have also hosted many events, conferences, prize ceremonies, galas, all over the world. And you moderate in English, French, German, but you also speak Italian, Spanish, and Dutch. So a long European career. But this career of journalist stopped brutally with Brexit. In June 2016, you decided to stop journalism. And as you write in your book, le Brexit force à faire des choix. Et donc, dans votre livre, donc Brexit, Autopsie d'une illusion, que vous avez écrit il y a 2 ans, vous prenez le rôle du médecin légiste qui va aller avec un scalpel voir quelles sont les raisons dans le corps et le cœur du Royaume-Uni. Pourquoi en est-on arrivé là? Et vous allez disséquer à la fois sur le plan économique, social, psychologique, historique, les raisons de ce Brexit. On attendait avec beaucoup de suspense le 31 décembre, on était vraiment dans un psychodrame. Il y a eu finalement un accord, mais est-ce qu'on est toujours dans le psychodrame? Est-ce qu'on est dans une grosse nébuleuse? Comment est la vie après le Brexit?
Oui, bonjour. D'abord, merci beaucoup de votre invitation, très gentil. Vous voulez que je réponde en français ou en anglais? Vous me posez la question en français.
On va alterner. Donc,
en français, alors, pour commencer.
Cette fois-ci en français.
Alors, est-ce que le psychodrame continue? Le Brexit a été un énorme psychodrame, mais ce n'est pas forcément le psychodrame que l'on croit. Pour moi, c'est une profonde crise d'identité qui existe depuis des décennies dans mon pays d'origine, qui cherche vraiment son rôle dans le monde moderne. C'est un pays qui a joué un rôle très unique dans le passé, et le Brexit a été un peu l'agitateur, le catalyste de cette crise d'identité, où beaucoup de questions ont été posées. Peut-être les fausses réponses ont été données, mais en tout cas, la blessure est là, le Brexit existe. Je ne sais pas si vraiment les questions, nous allons sans doute en parler, qui ont mené au Brexit, ont vraiment trouvé leur réponse dans le Brexit et surtout dans l'accord qui a été signé assez vite fait à la fin de l'année, et où nous commençons à peine maintenant à voir quels sont les effets en réalité.
Maria?
You have to unmute.
Maria. Vous m'entendez maintenant?
Très bien.
Très bien, très bien. So, Alex, thank you very much, and for your first impression. And I would like just to take your book and to come back for your confession that you did in the first on the first page of your book, saying that the 24th of June 2016 was the worst day of your life. You were deeply hearted, disappointed, and ashamed of your country. After that, and you say even Vous savez, mon père, c'était lors de l'entretien à la télévision française, BFM TV, vous dites, vous savez, mon père s'est battu pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Ma mère était secrétaire sous les bombes dans les Blitz. Autant je suis, croyez-moi, très fière de ce que la Grande-Bretagne a fait pour l'histoire européenne. Là, en revanche, j'ai honte. Après, vous dites que vous avez un peu décoloré. D'ailleurs, vous n'avez même pas trouvé les mots en anglais pour dire cela. Et puis, vous êtes un peu amusé à suivre avec une certaine distance ce qui s'est passé autour du Brexit. Et finalement, le 30 décembre est arrivé. Quel est aujourd'hui votre sentiment, ce que vous ressentez aujourd'hui?
Je ne sais pas si j'ai vraiment dit que c'était la pire journée de ma vie. Hein. J'ai dit que j'étais très aimable. Ce qu'il faut comprendre, pour comprendre les raisons qui ont fait que beaucoup de Britanniques comme moi, ce jour-là, ont senti que c'était une vraie déchirure, c'est parce que notre sens de l'identité était basé sur l'Europe. Le Brexit a beaucoup puisé dans les imageries de l'identité britannique du passé. C'est-à-dire que je ne sais pas si vous savez, par exemple, quelle est la sitcom la plus regardée à la télévision britannique depuis 60 ans. Si je pose la question à un public francophone, en général, ils me répondent toujours Monty Python ou Mr Bean ou Benny Hill. Pas du tout. C'est une sitcom qui est diffusée, qui est absolument inconnue ailleurs, inconnue au bataillon, c'est vraiment le cas de le dire, ailleurs qu'en Grande-Bretagne, parce que ça s'appelle Dad's Army. Et c'est une sitcom qui a été tournée dans les années 60 et qui est toujours diffusée en prime time, c'est-à-dire à 20h30. J'ai regardé, avant de vous parler, ce samedi, Dad's Army est rediffusé encore à la BBC, BBC2, à 20h30 le samedi soir, depuis 60 ans. Les mêmes, enfin, on peut dire que peut-être ils diffusent ça aussi parce que tous les acteurs sont morts depuis longtemps, donc il n'y a plus tellement de droits à équiter, donc ça ne coûte pas très cher. Mais il y a une raison plus profonde. Qu'est-ce que c'est Dad's Army? Si vous regardez sur YouTube le générique de Dad's Army, vous avez compris le Brexit. Le générique, c'est parce qu'il s'agit en fait de la vieille garde. C'est une série assez drôle, hein, sinon ça ne marcherait pas non plus si ce n'était pas drôle avec de très bons acteurs, mais c'est la vieille garde de ceux qui ne pouvaient pas faire la Seconde Guerre mondiale, mais qui sont restés pour défendre la petite Grande-Bretagne contre le grand envahisseur. Vous regardez le générique de cette sitcom, vous avez compris le Brexit. C'est sur une chanson d'époque qui s'appelle « Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler ?» Vous pensez que vous me moquez de qui, Monsieur Hitler, si vous pensez que l'Angleterre est fichue? Et vous voyez la croix gammée avancer partout. En Europe, c'est une sitcom, hein, avec la vaillante petite Angleterre. C'est le générique de cette émission qui passe encore en prime time aujourd'hui. Pourquoi? C'est parce que ça correspond à un vrai sens de l'identité qu'ont certains Britanniques, pas tous, pas des gens comme moi, de l'importance de la Grande-Bretagne, qui a eu quelque part, si je peux dire quelque chose de complètement choquant, le malheur d'avoir été du bon côté de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, parce que beaucoup de l'identité britannique repose sur la mythologie. Et encore une fois, je parle en tant que fils de quelqu'un dont les parents sont battus, donc je sais ce que c'est. Mon père a gagné des médailles dans la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Ma mère a été sous les bombes, donc je sais ce que cette génération a fait. Mais beaucoup de choses ont été... Par exemple, moi, j'ai vécu 10 ans à Berlin. Même moi, qui me targue de connaître assez bien l'histoire, il a fallu que j'aille habiter à Berlin, dans l'est de Berlin, pour voir des noms de généraux russes, pour vraiment comprendre à quel point la Grande-Bretagne n'avait pas gagné la Seconde Guerre mondiale toute seule. Et c'est un peu ça. Et par exemple, le UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, le parti qui était largement responsable de la mouvance pour le Brexit, avait pris le générique de Dad's Army en 2016 comme leur hymne en tournant les paroles. Et ce n'était plus, vous vous moquez de qui, Monsieur Hitler, vous moquez de qui, Monsieur Juncker, si vous pensez que l'Angleterre est fichue. Et c'est pour vous dire à quel point cette mythologie-là est importante pour certains Brexiteurs. Ce que je voulais vous dire, c'est que la génération, moi, mon père, si c'était battu...
Sorry, Alex, we have a lot of people asking to switch into English. So
English, okay.
yes, because it's, you know, dominant language.
Okay, let's do it in English then. I can
Thank
talk
you,
about my childhood.
It's easier for you, but I know that you manage all the languages very well. But now
I answer in the question that in the language of the question. People of my generation, my father fought in the Second World War, and yet it was that generation, people forgot, who actually took us into Europe, because my father was very proud to wait until I was old enough, at the age of 10. We didn't have very much money, but we went on continental camping holidays with a tent, because he wanted to show his son the continent that he had seen in its darkest hour, because he'd been fighting in Italy, but he wanted to show his son all the wonderful things he'd seen all the same in Europe. And it was him who made me a European. So a lot of British people's identity isn't in the kind of like the mythologies of the past, but was actually forged in the idea of Europe. I have a very personal story too, which you touched on. I'm gay. I grew up in Cornwall in the 60s, where there was absolutely no way you could, the word didn't even exist. So I felt totally isolated. And somehow for me, foreign languages, I always remember the very first French lesson I had. And our French teacher was called Mademoiselle Bridgewater. She was English, as you can see. And I always remember the frisson I had when she wrote on the blackboard, oui, the word for yes. I knew that French people said oui, but I imagined it was spelled oui, W-E, like we spell it in English. And I still to this day remember, and something spoke to the little boy that I was about how that was a way out. That was a kind of a passport, foreign languages. It was a country where people were different. I remember the first time, I'm an absolute fanatic about the Eurovision Song Contest. Even at my age, I still watch it, because the little boy in me, we had 2 channels in Cornwall in the 60s. But all of a sudden, there was this one program where people spoke foreign languages, where there was this other place which was magical. And this is what spoke to this little boy and made me, for example, very proud to be European. And there are an awful lot of British people who are the same as me. Our identity, people who voted Remain, basically, that's to say almost half the population, plus those of us who weren't allowed to vote. So we do have a very strong part of our identity, which is European. And that, to finally answer your question, is what was suddenly arraché, I prefer the French word, was suddenly ripped away, torn away from us in the month of June 2016 by this referendum, which some of us, and it's a fact that a lot of people don't know, that people like me, for example, weren't allowed to vote in, because I've been living in Europe for more than 15 years. So we were denied the vote, even though we had been promised it in 2 conservative election manifestos. So, and that mattered in a referendum, which wasn't even 52-48. If they'd have allowed, what, 400, 500, 600,000 of us to vote, I think the result could have been different. So yes, it was a kind of déchirure, a tearing away, people taking a part of my identity away. So yes, it did. I don't think I actually said it's the worst day in my life. I've had other bad things happen to me, but it was a pretty grim day all the same.
Okay, so you devoted a lot of pages in your book on this crisis of identity, and this is for you the key elements for what's happened finally, and you just saying that c'est une obsession, like obsession, irrational, this vote for leaving European Union. And you evoked what you have just said, this attachment to the past, the glorious Britain, Great Britain, etc., United Kingdom. And even in the one of your on your title, which is entitled livre, how do you say it in English? I I don't know.
A slap in the face.
Slap in the face, yes, of course. So could you just tell us what are these slaps of the face? A little bit more about that.
Well, I think it was, it's a very emotional thing. Identity is a totally emotional thing. You're talking about people's identity. And what has now happened is that our sense of identity has been taken away. If you take the current conflict about the fact that the UK is now threatening not to allow the EU ambassador status in London. I mean, it's like denying that at least half of us, and actually probably more now because people are changing their minds ever since the referendum. It's suddenly the EU, contrary to what happens in about 130 other countries around the world, in the UK won't even be allowed to have ambassador status. So it's a kind of like rewriting of our identity. And it's, if I can say something which is very controversial, but I'll say it because I've got the floor, so I can say what I like, but a lot of Brexiteers, like the Foreign Secretary, I can't help wondering if it's a kind of like need to prove how British they are, because a lot of the Brexiteers, like Boris Johnson, for example, were not actually born in Britain and don't have that, I mean, British roots, but it has lots of multinational roots, which I think is great. The Foreign Secretary's father was Czech, as a refugee, came to Britain. A lot of the Brexiteers, the head of Vote Leave, for example, was Gisela Stuart, who was born in Germany and came to the UK when the UK joined the common market, I think in 1970, well, it joined in 1973. I think she came just afterwards. And a lot of these, Daniel Kaczynski is another example, seem to have scores to settle against Europe or want to prove to what extent. Priti Patel is another example who came with Ugandan influence. Every time you see them on the television, they always have kind of like Union Jacks, like waving them angrily as if they've got some kind of something to prove about how British they are. Brexit seems to me very much like a desperate attempt to prove what being British is, because somehow they realize that the image that they have of their identity doesn't quite correspond to Britain's role in the world today. And the tragedy of Brexit is that we're now finding out that the great mantra of the Brexiteers, that they, Europe, need us more than we need them, is not true. I mean, if you look at what's happening now over the last 3 weeks since Brexit happened, the truth is patently that the European Union does not need the UK more than the UK needs the European Union, just on the level of it in terms of groceries, which can't get through the customs border.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for this answer. I would like also to come back to the structure of your book and the way you wrote it. It's so funny and full of humor, British humor, let's say, and also the titles and metaphors that you're using. For example, let's just mention a few of them: patat, crabs, potatoes, pigeon, coquelicot, etc., etc. Tell me, what is your favorite one?
Well, the story that sums up Brexit most for me was the Grimsby. I hope nobody from Grimsby is watching. Grimsby is a port in the north of the UK.
This is the crabs, huh? The crabs, you're talking about crabs.
They make a lot of seafood. I mean,
Yeah.
they fish a lot of seafood. And Grimsby voted 70% to leave the EU, but all their seafood is sold into the EU. I mean, a lot of the stuff they fish, British people don't eat. So they actually, after the majority of people had voted to leave, the Grimsby fishermen suddenly started realizing that maybe it wasn't such a good idea, because their market, the single EU market, was where they made all their money and where they sold all their products to. So they actually came up with a petition. You can look this up in the Grimsby Telegraph, which is where I found it, a petition asking if not seafood could be exempt from any tariffs which might happen. I mean, this was before the agreement was signed. Not that seafood should be exempt from these tariffs, but that Grimsby seafood should be exempt from the tariffs. And they actually went, there's a picture of them proudly showing their petition in front of 10 Downing Street, which they presented to Mrs. May, asking for an exception for Grimsby seafood. That is the kind of like Brexit exception. If you look on my Twitter feed, I retweet, and anybody who follows Brexit will have seen the same thing. Over the last 3 weeks, our Twitter feeds are absolutely full of fishermen. There's one very famous Devon fisherman who got retweeted for crazy, and he was an ardent Brexiteer. He was on the television saying that the fishing industry needed to take back control of British waters. We're not even, well, we're 3 weeks into Brexit now, and he's already on everybody's media feed saying, oh, this was a big mistake. I can't sell my fish into the European single market. I have Brexit red tape and so forth. I mean, seriously, these people, did they not know where they sold their fish? You'd think that the people would have done the research beforehand. If my livelihood, not just my livelihood, I think he has 50 people working for him. If their livelihoods depended on the market that they sold their fish to, you think that they would have taken the effort to find out what might happen if they voted to leave the EU. A lot of people on Twitter feeds feel very sorry for that. The kind of thing you read a lot is, I feel very sorry for these people who were lied to by politicians and so forth. That's undoubtedly true, and that's the case with a lot of people, but these people had access to the same information that we had as well. And somebody in the position whose whole livelihood depends on selling fish, if he can't be bothered to make the effort to look into where his bread is buttered, as we say, or to see where his principal market is, I do find it a bit difficult to feel sorry for him now when he suddenly starts tweeting and saying, oh, well, if I had the choice again, I wouldn't vote for Brexit because I can't sell my fish. It's the kind of exceptionalism, but it's also, and maybe we'll touch on this too, a specifically British problem of the British press. You said that I was very lucky. I did a European press review on French radio for about 30 years, where I would read newspapers from 70, well, read is a big word. I have basically 2 minutes per news per country almost. So I'd look through very quickly and look at the leaders, the few sentences from the editorial. But I looked at the press from all around Europe, and I think I'm objective enough to say that Britain has a very different press and a very different attitude to its press than any other countries. And the press has a huge influence. I mean, in terms of newspapers, obviously it's a bit different now because people read them online, so it's a bit more difficult to get the figures. But 10 years ago, for example, which is what mattered because that's when Brexit minds were being, the whole idea of Brexit was fermenting and starting. I mean, a newspaper like The Sun, for example, sold more newspapers every day than the whole of the French press put together. And if you look at the role of the British press, it actually comes down to the Second World War again. I'm convinced of this, that there's an attitude in Britain that, well, we can say what we like in the press because we fought for freedom and so forth. If you Google the front pages of a paper like The Express or the Daily Mail, and the word migrants, and the way it's used, I, as somebody who read the European press professionally for 30 years, there's not a single other country in Europe which would dare to put that on its front pages. I mean, there was kind of like front pages, the whole montage of the front pages of the Daily Mail, which sold 3 million copies a day, about migrants and refugees. There was one headline which was, be careful of, and it put a certain nationality, which I'm not going to name because I think it's shameful, be careful of these people because they steal things from your homes. That was on the front page of a national newspaper. Can you imagine that on the front page of even a newspaper like Bild in Germany, which is a similar popular newspaper? The role of the British press is absolutely enormous and there's a really funny, and now it's kind of changing. It's changing its opinion, but in a very strange way. If you look at today's Telegraph, for example, the Telegraph, which is what I call a pit bull of anti-Europeanness. If you look at the Telegraph today, there's a picture of Angela Merkel looking very depressed. And the Telegraph says something, I can't remember the exact title, but it's Angela Merkel is now aware that Brexit is her fault or her responsibility, I think is the word, which is very strange because the newspaper itself spent its time telling us how wonderful Brexit is. And yet at the same time, there's this dichotomy about it's all her fault. So, even the newspapers in their strange pro-Brexit world confuse. If something is so wonderful, you wouldn't say it's her fault. You would say, thank you, Angela Merkel, but you wouldn't say that Brexit is the responsibility of Angela Merkel. You have this picture they've chosen deliberately of Angela Merkel, who looks very depressed. It's a totally kind of, and I think the role of the British press is enormous. And the fact that it's allowed, and the fact that most of these newspapers, like the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and the Sun, don't even belong to British or even European people. If you look at the great media magnate who is behind a lot of this, Rupert Murdoch, he's what, half Australian, half American. The Telegraph belongs to the Barclay brothers, who are tax exiles. I don't know what particular island somewhere where they don't have to pay tax. So I think that the British, and also even the more established media, I think that Britain, I'm a journalist, so I've worked at the BBC. Britain has very good media, which is rightly, maybe changed recently, but rightly seen as being a model throughout the world. But if you look, for example, one thing that struck me, if you look at the BBC website, they had a thing called Fact Checker, which checked facts about Brexit at one stage. And on one of their fact-checking pages, they talked about EU freedom of movement. And I remember very clearly, I read it, and it said, EU freedom of movement means that EU citizens can live and work freely in the UK. That was it. There was no mention at all of the fact that it works the other way, that it's reciprocal. And in fact, over the last 4.5 decades, probably more people like me, and I see a few British names also watching us today, have taken advantage of living, working, studying, retiring in the EU, but that wasn't mentioned. The BBC fact checker page bought into this fact, the fact that EU freedom of movement was something that was imposed on us, rather than the fact that it was a reciprocal right, that in fact, over the 4.5 decades that Britain was in the common market or the EU, more of us have taken advantage of than the other way, which is much more recent. So the media, I think, have a tremendous responsibility. And also in terms of the people who work in the media, the most famous example is the person who started all the lies about Brussels and the bananas in the first place, who now, well, you know very well where he's ended up, in 10 Downing Street. He got fired for lying about, well, different things, but...
You're talking about Boris Johnson.
You've got it, yes, our favorite. Anyway, sorry, maybe I should be more objective, but there we are.
Yes. Yes, this is, we will come back to the role of media. Blondine is going to ask you maybe some few questions. I would like to come back to this obsession about, you know, identity and also security and health, because you talk about this health obsession in Kingsley. It was used during the campaign, that the bad condition of the health system in the United Kingdom. The European Union was responsible for this bad condition. So another thing that I was quite surprised, it was the ID card. The British people, they don't have the ID card. So they are obsessed by the security, to take over the control of the borders, and then they don't have the ID cards. How do you explain it?
Well, it's a conception of identity. For example, it's true. I grew up in Britain, and identity for me is not something administrative. It's something, I've been living in France for 40 years, so I get it. I've become French now. I'm very proud to have my French carte d'identité and my French passport. But identity is something which in Britain is regarded as being an emotional thing rather than an administrative thing. And we don't have, British people don't have identity papers. There's not the equivalent of the carte d'identité. There's a passport, but you only really need a passport if you go elsewhere. For example, people of my parents' generation live their whole lives sometimes without passports because they never left the country. And you can't ask somebody to justify, as the French would say, justifier their identity. The concept doesn't exist. Identity cards were, Tony Blair tried to bring in some identity cards after the 9/11 and the terrorist threats, and he tried to bring in some identity cards. I think they were also brought in the Second World War, but they were immediately abolished afterwards. Tony Blair brought in a new identity card, I think in 2003, he tried to introduce it, but listen to this, it was voluntary. The idea was that you had to pay for a voluntary identity card. And so obviously, if you were a terrorist, the solution would be not to pay and not to opt in for an identity card. I mean, it's like the very strange conception. And when the Conservatives came to power in 2010, I think it was the very first act that was voted through Parliament was to not only abolish these voluntary identity cards, but to actually physically destroy the building and all the records where they were. I mean, it's such a kind of emotive issue. For example, one of the leading Brexiteers, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's now the leader of the House, I remember very clearly him saying during the Brexit debate, we're not one of those European countries where you have to prove your identity. But I grew up in the country, so I kind of get it. For example, when I live in Paris, but the idea of going out with an identity card, I still take it as a bit of a kind of like an affront that I'm going to have to prove who I am because I just am who I am. So I do it because I've become French and I'm very proud to be French, but it's a whole thing about identity too, which is a slightly different thing. But that doesn't mean, for example, that, you see, Brexiteers will say it's because, I've heard them say it, it's because we're not the kind of country which has to follow people and to control people like the Continentals do. Not with papers, but they do it in other ways. Like, for example, anybody who's been to London knows that it is by far the most CCTV'd city in the world, I think, as capital cities. London has the most CCTV cameras. So even if you're not being controlled in an administrative way, you are certainly being controlled in what you do in terms of your movement. So it's just, each person has their own conception of contrôler l'identité. It's also quite interesting because it's difficult to translate that into English.
To control and to check, yeah.
To check, yes. You don't say to control. To control somebody's identity sounds, well, it sounds very much like CCTV to me, to be honest. But anyway, so that's one of the joys of... two
Okay,
languages.
thank you. Maybe I will give now the floor to Blondine.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya. I would like now you to speak about young people, young British people, because in fact, we didn't hear them really during the Brexit campaign. And afterwards, we could have thought that after the Brexit was decided, after the referendum, they would mobilize in order to have to give another point of view and to engage in favor of Europe. But there was, well, they remained quite silent. And it's very amazing because universities, for instance, UK universities are so attractive. So what are going to be the consequences in both, for both sides? So for young British people and for young European people.
Yeah, they are very silent, but like my dog here. I'd like to point out this is a peluche. It's a kind of it's not a very tame dog. It's a peluche. It's a pretend dog. In case you're wondering why my dog is not more reactive to what I'm saying. I don't know. Young people. You see, the thing was that I said that British people living for more than 15 years, the real Europeans like me, weren't allowed to vote. Well, neither were young people. They were not allowed to vote, and it's their future in the Brexit referendum, 16 to 18-year-olds. They were allowed to vote in 2014. Young Scottish people could vote on the future of their country, 16 to 18. And yet young British people were deemed suddenly to be too young to make a decision about their future. And this is important because the result wasn't more than, it wasn't even 52-48, it was 51.9, I think, in the referendum. If they'd let us, the European British, plus the young people, who are two sections who are vastly pro-European, I think the result would have been different if David Cameron had carried out his election pledges to give us back the vote. It's one of the tragedies, I think, of Brexit that I think young people, there's so many young people who now say things like, ah bon? Well, they don't say that, but they say, really, we won't be able to study in Europe anymore? We won't be able to go and live in Europe? And you kind of say, well, no, that's the whole point. That was, it's not a given. It's part of free movement that people can study, live. I told you I lived in Berlin for 10 years, half and half with Paris. Why? Because I could. All of a sudden, about 15 years ago, because I studied German too, I thought, because I love going to Berlin, so I thought, well, why don't I just kind of like set up a flat here and have a bit of a life, because it was so cheap at the time. It was really cheap to rent for 200 euros a month or something. You could rent a flat in Berlin. So I just set up a life for myself in Berlin. Why? Because as a European citizen, I could. And now, all of a sudden, all this stuff about Erasmus, for example. Erasmus is absolutely fantastic. You said that I'm way too old to have taken advantage of Erasmus, but I used to be a teacher, so I've seen the enormous advantages that Erasmus brings. The fact of when you're young to have the right to go and study, but not only study, because you can study online. It's not a case of going and reading Kant in German in Germany, although it's interesting to have the atmosphere because you could read him online, but it's a case of going and tasting German food, of speaking German in the streets, of taking the tram, of living in, having to open your windows contractually in a German flat because you have to sign a paper saying, I will air the flat for 10 minutes a day. It's living in a foreign country, living in a country which is not your own, and having the right to do it. I've been living in France now for 40 years. Quand je parle français, j'ai un accent. I have an accent because I didn't learn it as a mother tongue. My parents don't speak languages. I learned it, as I told you earlier, with Mademoiselle Bridgewater. Every day.
Lovely accent.
Oh, thank you. Every day, people say to me, "You've got a lovely accent," or "Vous avez un accent," things like that. But nobody has ever said to me, "You don't have the right to be here. What are you doing here?" Because I've always been a European living in Europe, and that's the thing that is the tragedy of Brexit, is that young British people are now are now finding out that it isn't a kind of God-given right for British people to study, to live, to work. All the, not the majority by any means, but all the British expats who live in Spain, a lot of them voted for Brexit. Now they are surprised that they too have to follow the rule of 90 days only, and they can't live in their houses in sunny Spain for more than 90 days. So people are waking up to the realities of Brexit, which are things that they took for granted before. It's like musicians. A week ago, a petition was launched because British musicians have suddenly realized they won't be able to tour as easily. They'll need visas and permits, and they need to fill in 1,000 forms, and it won't be as easy to tour Europe as it was when Britain was in the EU. So there's now this petition with Elton John and leading musicians, even Roger Daltrey of The Who is a Brexiteer. He's a Brexiteer. He was on the television during the Brexit referendum, saying, I don't know if I can repeat this. I'll try and put it in a not rude version. He said, "We could tour Europe before the effing EU," which is not true, actually. People have found that it wasn't that easy to tour Europe before Britain was in the common market. And so he's a big Brexiteer. Now he signs this petition saying, please, can we have an opt-in that we don't need special papers to tour Europe? So bit by bit, people are starting to realize the opportunities. And it's the one lesson the reason I get so passionate about Brexit is because I live in France. And in France, it's still a pretty minority thing, but the people who are real passionate, a lot of people criticize the EU here, but the passionate Brexiteers are still more or less in the minority. But I think it's my duty also to point out to people that a lot about Europe is people taking things for granted, thinking it's a normal situation. It's like with trade. A lot of British companies are now realizing that it's actually very difficult. The reason that we joined in the first place, the reason that all my childhood, I can remember for 13 years, the UK was knocking on the door of the common market saying, please, can we come in? General de Gaulle said no, twice. The reason that they wanted to get in was because trade is not natural between different countries. It's a vast achievement for which the British were largely responsible, the single market. It's the same with studying. It's the same with free movement, to answer your question. And unfortunately, young people, who 80% of them voted to remain, are now seeing that their government hasn't defended their right to take part in Erasmus. It's a huge tragedy. My life has been infinitely richer because I have lived in other people's countries. I've lived my life in other people's language. I've lived in several countries. I've worked in Brussels. I spent my whole time, when it was possible, taking the Thalys to go and be a journalist at the European Parliament in Strasbourg and in Brussels. I've hosted loads of conventions all over Europe. My life has been, and I come from a very modest background. My parents weren't rich at all. I grew up in a little fishing village in Cornwall. But because of free movement, because of Europe, it's given me so many opportunities, and my life has been so much richer simply because I could go and live in Berlin. I could come and live in Paris. And that door has been closed by Brexiteers on their children. I think it's a tragedy. There we are.
Mm-hmm.
As you see, I'm not a big fan of Brexit, but
I think that we share, most of all of us, we share your position, of course. Now, let us speak about Britain's place in the world in the future. And before I ask you the question, I would like to ask our colleagues through a poll. So I ask Kobe to present the poll. We would like to see what is the opinion of our colleagues. So the second poll, Hobby. the second poll.
No, not the first one.
That was about the place of Britain in the world.
Okay, well, it's up to you.
So, what do you think will be the future of Britain after Brexit? It will become no, sorry, Obi, it's not the right version. It will be a big Denmark, that is to say, a great Denmark. That is to say, in order to take a title from the magazine The Economist, a great Denmark, that is to say, a decent North European place without great power pretensions. Or it will be a Trojan horse of the United States for the EU, or it will be indeed global Britain, so a powerful country in the world, or the United Kingdom will break up, as there may be independence of Scotland, or we could think that there will be a reunification of Ireland, or you have other ideas. So please, dear colleagues, could you answer to this poll?
I'm so sorry that it was the first question it's not the be part of Denmark. It's the question like Denmark, the place of the Britain, it will be like Denmark. It's the country which is not looking for the powerful position in the world. This is the right question, sorry.
I'm very anti-Brexit, but even I don't think that Britain will become part of Denmark. I'm sorry if anything, but I don't think that's very probable.
What is the question?
So Obi, do you have the results of the poll?
Well, that's interesting.
Alex.
Yes, it's very interesting because look at yesterday's Sunday Times. I tweeted, if you want to follow all this, you can follow my Twitter, which is actually much more up to date than my book, if I'm perfectly honest. If you follow Alex Taylor News, I tweet passionately about Brexit 5 times a day. And yesterday, the Sunday Times, the first page was the disunited kingdom. I mean, it's 3 weeks. We're not even 3 weeks after real Brexit. Brexit technically happened on the 31st of January last year, but the real Brexit, the Brexit that hurts when Britain left the customs union and the single market, was at the end of last year. So 3 weeks in, and the Sunday Times has got polls all over its front page about how the United Kingdom could break up because of Brexit. Why? Well, first of all, the most surprising thing, I was expecting to talk to you about Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yes, this is the question that we had received from our colleagues.
Okay, well, yes, yeah. But the most surprising thing about yesterday is Wales, Le Pays de Galles, the country nobody talks about because Wales voted to leave, is what everybody says. And it did. A majority of the Welsh voted, was quite poor economically, voted like Cornwall, where I grew up, with England, apart from London and several other regions, to leave. So it's now a bit surprising that even the Welsh, there's a big movement for independence from England saying, oh, we don't want to be part of this. But the big problems are with, you see, I've always thought that there's an English saying that comes from Shakespeare, methinks the lady protesteth too much. And I often think of that about Brexit. In French, il me semble que la dame proteste de trop. It's when you kind of like, you're not sure of something. So you kind of shout it to make yourself seem, methinks, it's old English, methinks the lady protesteth too much. For me, that's Brexit. It's very much a case of often waving the flag to try and prove things. I don't know, I went on to that.
And they have, sorry, if you allow me, there is a question, UK in the future, because this is the other option that we allow to our colleague, a European Singapore trying to maintain the union with an escaping Scotland and Ulster.
Well, that's it, you see. I mean, there's a big difference which people don't realize between the situations in Northern Ireland and Scotland. as part of the Good Friday Agreement, the people who live in Northern Ireland have the constitutional right, if a majority of them want a referendum on reunification with Ireland, they have the right to have a referendum. That's not the case in Scotland. You could say there's a moral right to have a referendum, and the Scottish nationalists with Nicola Sturgeon have already started, of course, talking about a second referendum, because there are elections in Scotland in May, in which the Scottish nationalists were expected to have a landslide, because now all the opinion polls since Brexit in Scotland have been in favour of Scottish independence. So there's going to be a huge movement for that. After Brexit, it's now become I think it'll be the big political issue in Britain over the next few years, is the survival of the United Kingdom. That's what I was trying to say before I lost my train of thought, is that for me, Brexit is actually, I tweet this very much, Brexit is very anti-British, because it seems to be leading 3 weeks in. Yesterday's Sunday Times, look at the front cover, a huge British flag with disunited kingdom. Not this, disunited kingdom written on it. So I think that'll be the political issue. And if you look at Northern Ireland, where does identity hurt? It hurts in what people eat in their pockets. Northern Ireland is being cut off from the rest of the United Kingdom or Great Britain because there has to be a border somewhere. Theresa May, as soon as she said, we don't want to be in the single market or in the customs union, she meant there has to be a customs border somewhere. And the idiocy of the Brexiteers is that they never admitted that there will have to be a border somewhere. Either there's a border in the Irish Sea, or there's a border on the island of Ireland. It's so, this is one of the reasons why I find Brexiteers so annoying, because it's so hypocritical, because one of their slogans was, let's take back control of our borders. So there's all this stuff you read about, we're controlling the borders at Dover, we're controlling our borders and so forth. But on the other hand, they deny the very existence of a border, because it's problematic, in Ireland. There's a video of Boris Johnson just before the last election, more than a year ago, when he was frankly a little bit drunk, surrounded by some Irish businessmen who said, well, what do we do if there's customs forms to be able to export goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland? What do we do? There's maybe customs forms, what do we do? And he said, tear them up, put them in the bin and give me a ring, suggesting that they wouldn't need it. Everybody is finding, if you look at all the pictures that are being tweeted about food, it's like Marks and Spencer's shops in Paris too. You can't import food. There's incredibly complicated rules about rules of origin, which I'm sure people are watching know far more about me than I do. But the border exists somewhere. So people in Northern Ireland, also because we were talking about Erasmus before, but because the Republic of Ireland is now kindly offering people in Northern Ireland, young people, to pay for their Erasmus because they have joint citizenship. They can identify as Irish or British. So the Republic of Ireland is offering to give these young people what the people in the rest of the UK don't have. So up until recently, the Irish question, like for example, somebody of my generation, I talked about my youth when I grew up in Cornwall. Every time I watched the television, you turn the television on in the 60s or 70s, the leading story was about the Troubles or the IRA, bombs. The Irish question, the Irish border was, I think, the most armed border in Europe, including the Iron Curtain, in terms of the sheer presence of armed guards at every border. It's an incredibly emotional issue. And Brexit has reignited that. The European Union, with its free single market, helped to install kind of bureaucratic peace and for goods to flow freely. And it's part also of the very hypocritical Brexit talk that the Minister for Northern Ireland was on the television last Thursday on a program called Question Time, and he was telling viewers, he's a Brexiteer, telling people of the enormous advantages for Northern Ireland of being in the EU single market. I mean, you couldn't get anything so ridiculous. It's like he's saying Brexit is great. It's even better for Northern Ireland because it's still in the EU single market. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sure, the question I get asked a lot is which will be independent first, or well, not independent, or which will come first, Scottish independence or reunification of Ireland? The Irish have the right, the people in Northern Ireland, and it's a demographical issue too. Like when I was young, it was about 60%, 30% Protestant Catholics. I'm being very kind of like schematic, but that was it. Now it's 50-50. And with a young generation that are overwhelmingly pro-EU. So I think if there's another referendum in Northern Ireland, I think Irish reunification is, and the thing about it is, I don't think that Brexiteers care. I don't think they care. I think that they've made the calculation. I think that Boris Johnson, when he met up with Leo Varadkar just before the election to try and get some agreement of this really complicated Irish border problem, I think he just kind of like must have said to him, well, in the long term, it's going to be reunified anyway, but help me for the moment to find some solution so we can gloss over it. I don't know, but I think that's probably what happened, because how else do you explain his cavalier attitude when he told the Northern Ireland businessman, tear up the forms, put them in the bin and ring me up. They're now all tweeting, what are we supposed to do? Our businesses are going bankrupt because we can't import or export or get the exports we need, and shops are empty in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom.
Yes, this is a lot of paradoxes and a lot of situations that we cannot even foresee. But we have a lot of questions from our participants, and there are some of them linked to the possibility of the reunification of another referendum. Do you see another referendum in UK, and after that the possibility to rejoin the European Union?
No.
No.
I can tell you, I watch British television a lot, and the Brexit debate, once again, because it's such an emotional issue, the Brexit debate has created such a clivage, I don't know how to say anything, it's such a split in British society, because basically, for a long time, you were either a Remainer or a Leaver, and your whole politics was defined by that. I mean, I remember, I'm just as guilty as everybody else, but you see somebody on the television and it's like going to a kind of a children's pantomime. You kind of like, you have to know whether they're a Leaver or a Remainer in order to know whether you agree with them, whatever they say, or you disagree with them. It's like those plays with children's plays where you have to go boo if you hear somebody you don't. I mean, it's really is on that level. It left such a scar for 5 years. Like you couldn't turn on, like this program Question Time, the one I was talking about last Thursday with the Northern Ireland minister. It's now totally different because they talk about COVID, obviously. But for 5 years, it was just about Brexit. And they have, it's basically, you have 5 panel members and 200 people in the audience asking them questions and clapping and reacting. And the violence that there was in the kind of like, on both sides, of people hated each other because of, you could see also on the program, which was very interesting, the grid in Britain depends, the electricity grid depends when people make tea. And if the program talked about Brexit, when it stopped talking about Brexit, people would tune out. They would go and make their tea. You could see there was a kind of like an increase in electricity demand because nobody would be interested in anything else because it's such a passionate thing. I mean, I think it's good because at least some people were interested somewhere in Europe. I think the problem in the country I live in, for example, in France, is that there's a total indifference to anything European. I think that's a whole, I've always wondered which was worse, an indifference to European issues. Like, for example, on French news, I've criticized France a little bit now, but on French news, the day that Ursula von der Leyen was nominated head of the European Commission, that got a mention of 15 seconds, 20 minutes after the opening of the news. I mean, I think that's a problem for Europe too, is its communication. But in Britain, in France, there's a lot of indifference to European stuff. In Britain, it was just such a heated debate. It's left such a scar. They're not going to go through that again. The only thing is that I think it'll be, as Clinton said, the economy stupid. That was his quote. I think that economic factors, I mean, people forget that in the 70s, Britain was the economic basket case, the crazy person, the crazy man of Europe. I grew up eating baked beans by candlelight on a gas heater because there was the 3-day week. We were only allowed electricity for three days a week at one stage because of the miners' strike. There was inflation of 25%. It was an economic, the British government went to the International Monetary Fund begging for a loan. I'm saying this because the reason that Britain overcame its kind of like identity stuff and asked for 13 years, knocking on the door, please, can we come into the common market, was because of the economic need. So this is awful what I'm going to say, but I mean, Britain got prosperous because it was part of the world's biggest, most prosperous single market. That's why Britain became prosperous, with even Mrs. Thatcher was one of the instigators of the single market. So to answer your question, will there be another poll? If economic conditions make it such that things do get better, and I mean, you know, that one of the great things about Brexit was these new fantastic deals that Britain will be signing in the future. Well, it doesn't seem to be happening. I mean, what if anybody was there who was going to give Britain a great trade deal post-Brexit, it was Mr. Trump. He's an ardent Brexiteer. He said Brexit was a great idea. He didn't like the European Union. And yet, where's the deal that he signed with Britain? It hasn't been done. And even if Boris Johnson was photographed doing this over the weekend, talking to Joe Biden, there's still no trade deal. And it's certainly not a great priority for Joe Biden's administration to give Britain a wonderful deal. So Britain has left the world's biggest single market, created all kinds of economic hurdles to doing trade with the EU single market, but it hasn't got any other trade deals to speak of, which are radically different from what it had when it was in the EU. They've just had a rollover of most of the deals that they've been able to renegotiate, except that I think they can sell more cheese for some reason to the Japanese, who are lactose intolerant for the great part. So I'm not sure that's a great win.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here from somebody who asked to the discussion seems to steer into too much emotion and anecdote. It will be interesting, how does Mr. Taylor see Brexit from the EU point of view, as he agrees rejoin is not realistic? EU would not accept UK with open arms after the last few years. So indeed, Brexit is an opportunity for you. In what way?
It's true. I think Brexit, but that's the whole point I'm trying to make, that Brexit is not an economic, it's not about economic reasons. If it was about economic reasons, I don't think people would have voted to withdraw from the world's biggest market, which Britain was very instrumental in setting up. My whole point that I tried to, this is my point, but for most people, especially most British people, for most Brexiteers and most Remainers, Brexit is an emotional issue. It's not an economic issue. It makes no economic sense whatsoever. So I make no apologies for talking about the emotional issue, because for me, that's the reason that a lot of people don't understand. And it is about personal experience. That's why a lot of us, it means so much. From the EU's point of view, I don't see, because they've got a fantastic deal. The EU has got a fantastic deal with Britain. Because if you look at it very basically, if I go into my French supermarket opposite where I'm sitting today, there's two French supermarkets, a Franprix and Carrefour. If I go into them, there's very little British stuff. There used to be 1 or 2 tins of canned beans, baked beans, and I think I was the only person who bought it, maybe a little bit of decent tea. But apart from that, the supermarket, cheddar, but you now get cheddar from Ireland. So my French supermarket isn't going to suffer that much if it can't get its supplies of baked beans. I mean, Marks and Spencer's is an example, but there's a few Marks and Spencer's shops in Paris, but they're not very common throughout the rest of the European Union. So the EU basically, because it can source all its food and its merchandise generally from 27 plus countries who are still in the customs union and the single market, it's not going to notice Brexit that much in terms of what it imports. Whereas the UK is already starting to experience difficulties. Britain doesn't grow bananas. Britain imports tomatoes, lettuce, so all these things are already starting to be missing on supermarket shelves. And there's a reason why, for example, Britain is letting trucks through without too much trouble at Dover, whereas the opposite is not the case. France is now the outpost of the European Union, customs union and single market. So it has to control. That's why Dutch policemen have confiscated. It's made a huge headlines in Britain that Dutch policemen have dared to confiscate sandwiches from British truck drivers, ham sandwiches, as they came into the European Union. Well, that's what it's like. I don't know if you've been to Australia or if you've been to America. You can't just turn up with food. I went to Australia with a Christmas pudding about 10 years ago because I wanted to meet my boyfriend at the time's mother, and she was British originally, so I wanted to please her with a Christmas pudding. And I tried to smuggle it in because I'd forgotten that you couldn't take food and I hadn't thought. And then I saw these signs saying you cannot bring food into Australia. So I got fined £200 and had my pudding confiscated. Well, it's the same with the EU single market. You can't just bring food into it now. And that's why Marks and Spencer's in Paris, which I love because childhood tastes remain, is now absolutely empty because you simply cannot import all this stuff. So to answer your question, I think the UK is going to suffer a lot more from this deal than the EU, because contrary to what the Brexiteers told us, they don't need us more than we need them. The Brexiteers said they need us, the EU needs us more than we need the EU. Well, it's actually, in terms of what's happening over the last 3 weeks, it's obvious that that's not the case.
Okay, Alex, I have another comment from Dietmar. Ironically, Brexit will reinvigorate UK's multinational and historic stance on the global arena to help the US in Asia. But it will also entrench the social gap to not so multinational communities to the latter Brexit supplies all sorts of excuse. Very brief, how can we overcome the social divide present in Brexit UK, but in other EU member states? Who could be the cure?
Not sure I understand the
What
question.
would be the cure?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Brexit was very much one in terms of fomenting real problems. I mean, why, we touched on it before, but why was the main slogan of Brexiteers, let's spend £350 million a week on the NHS instead of spending it on Europe? But health is a national issue. The EU has nothing to do with health. If Britain had wanted to invest more in its national health system, for example, the fact that now there's a huge nursing shortage in Britain is simply because Britain didn't invest in training nurses, British nurses, to be nurses. It's much cheaper for Britain to say, oh, there's Romanian and Polish nurses who have already been trained thanks to their countries. We can pay them more than they would earn in Romania and Poland. So please come over here. And so they come over to Britain. Nothing stopped Britain from training its nurses, except it didn't. So now there's a huge loss of labor as people are going back into the European Union. Britain has some of the poorest regions in the EU. I grew up in Cornwall. Cornwall had huge structural funds from the EU, and yet Cornwall voted to leave. I think there's a real issue too about the European Union. It's not enough to put a European flag on things which are sponsored by the European Union. I think that the European Union is too shy to actually promote itself. The person who criticized the emotional thing, I think that's precisely the problem. It is an emotional thing. Europe doesn't sell itself emotionally enough. For example.
Okay, Alex, this is the introduction for the second poll that I would like Obi to share, and we will allow our colleagues to participate and to give you their comments. So the question, significance of Brexit, what was the significance of Brexit for you? The beginning of the end of the EU institution have a communication problem, the rise of populism, a sign that EU policies need to be co-created with citizens. So please to click, and then we will see the results. Romania is not very happy about the loss of its young educated professionals, educated future students. This is another comment. You know, we are waiting for the results, but I read some. What about fish? You know, a lot of questions we have. What are the chances to become a global Britain? This is a question, because yeah, I know, if you know, the Marc Roche, qui a écrit un livre, Brexit va réussir. We are not going to cover everything today.
He's changed his mind since he wrote that book. I've seen him on the television recently saying he doesn't have that.
This is another point of view. It would be interesting to invite him together with you, but maybe this is in the next. So we have the rise of populists. This is interesting. The first place, and the second is the EU institution have a communication problem. The third one is sign that EU policies need to be co-created with citizens.
Well, I totally agree with that. I've been producing programs about Europe for 30 years on French television. There's one thing I can tell you. I did a program on French television called Continental, which was where I introduced news.
Alex, we have 8 minutes. 8 minutes.
From all around Europe. And I always remember my program director rang me up one day and said, we've done a sondage. I mean, this was 20 years ago, but we've done a sondage. And would it be possible for you not to say the word Europe, because it makes people zap onto another? I was doing a program about Europe, and I wasn't allowed to mention the word Europe. I got around it because at the time we were still part of the European Union in Britain. I was only British. So I talked about notre continent, our continent, which has an emotional pull. And it comes back to what I'm saying about the person who said it's very emotional. I think it's precisely the lack of emotion which is the problem. The EU doesn't promote itself as an emotional issue, it stops it. A very good example of that is if you look at a billet de banque, a banknotes, the euro. I, for one, am very proud to be part of this project where a country has come together and everybody has the same money. I mean, it's obviously got its problems, but instead of something we can all be proud of, they deliberately created on the banknotes. I know it's different from for the coins, but anonymous things which wouldn't offend anybody. They should have put kind of like emotional things that so much Europe can be proud of. I don't know, Da Vinci or Goethe or whatever, maybe at one stage Shakespeare, if we could have kept them in. I think the problem is that Europe doesn't sell itself at all in terms of emotion. And that's what you need, as Brexit proved, in order to get people engaged or committed to it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we have to arrive to the end of our webinar. I have the last question to you, Alex. What is your dream today? Because you had a dream when you arrived to Paris in the 80s. It's probably not the same that you had at that time. What is your dream today?
Actually, it is the same as to live in a continent that my father and his generation fought so hard to create. I'm living in a Europe which, I don't know if anybody has noticed, but over the last decades, we haven't had a major war because we've all been in the corridors of Brussels and Strasbourg, having arguments about quotas and this and that and so forth, and having arguments about translations into Finnish and Basque and so forth. We haven't actually been having a war. And we've all lived in each other's, I mean, we're allowed to go and live in each other's countries. I think that my dream is that Europe realizes that there's an emotional case to be made for Europe and that it can actually sell itself. And that once you take it away from people, it's only when you take it away. There's a Joni Mitchell song, I think it's Joni Mitchell, Yellow Taxi. I think it's Joni.
Yellow Taxi, yes.
Yeah,
I know.
You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's the song that was in my head after Brexit for about 2 months. I kept hearing, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's the case with so many British people who are only now over their Twitter feed saying, but we didn't realize that this was only possible because we were in the European Union. And of course, one thing that's really important to say is that since the Brexit referendum, every single opinion poll that's been done in Britain shows that there is now a majority against Brexit. So people, I think the European Union should sell itself much more emotionally and much more simply to show people what it actually means, what it means to young people to be able to go and live in other people's countries, what it means to be able to sell your goods anywhere in Europe, to work anywhere in Europe, what it means to not be at war with each other. And
this is a very good advice. Would you like to become the advisor of Madame von der Leyen to help her how to communicate better?
Well, I don't know if she needs me, but I can tell you, as a media person, it's the one thing that, I mean, as I say, in France, like, for example, the sentence I've heard the most often over the last 30 years of talking about Europe on French media, radio and television is every time I knocked on the door of a program director, they would say, l'Europe n'intéresse personne, Alex. Europe doesn't interest anybody. It doesn't interest anybody because they don't treat it as a kind of an emotional thing. It's something that we mustn't offend anybody, so let's put anonymous bridges on our banknotes so that nobody would be offended. That's not the way to get people involved. People are proud to be Europe, and when you take it away from them, look at Britain, people really noticed that it was something that they really cared about. So before it's too late, I think that we ought to start investing, making Europe a bit sexy, emotional, something that people actually care about.
Okay, thank you. Let's do that. We will, we have 3 minutes. Blandine, do you have any questions more?
Just a question about languages.
Yes,
Alex
this
is
my
really
language. Yeah.
Do you think that we are condemned to globish, or with Brexit and at least within Europe and in institutions, may another language regain some favor?
It's very hard to speak a foreign language. I mean, a language is not your own. It's incredibly hard. I mean, I find this hard to talk about because my native language is English, and I host international conventions. And you know as well as I do that if you go to an international convention, I mean, I would like it to be a kind of multilingual thing, but they're not. Usually there is a language which is globish. We have it. It's not going to change overnight just because Brexit or just because we want it to. So at least we can talk to each other. I mean, at least when, you know, Merkel meets up with Johnson, they have some kind of language they can talk to together. It would be good to kind of say, well, no more English, everybody speaks French. But I've been living in France for 40 years and I still don't know whether it's un passoire or une passoire. I can't remember. I never remember. Un azalé, une azalée, but there's a lot of French people who don't know that one. So it's difficult to learn languages, but there is a language which is a kind of like international lingua franca, which is globish. I mean, it's not perfect, but at least it's there.
Just to answer to some colleagues who were asking if the book is translated in English. No, I let Alex explaining why.
Well, because I wrote it to explain Brexit to French people. I think most British people don't need to know about Dad's Army. They know about it, whereas French people have never heard about Dad's Army or identity issues. So I wrote it in French for French
Okay,
people.
thank you. It was, by the way, it was very well done.
Thank you.
I adored your book. And the last comment I just pick up is, as a Brit, my dreams, it's for the colleague, I don't know the name. As a Brit, my dream is that the United Kingdom rejoins. I will fight for that all my life. Many Brits feel like that. We are heartbroken. This is emotional, isn't it?
That's what I've been trying to say. I totally agree. It's emotional. It's not the economy stupid. It's an emotional thing. And I think if you don't understand that, you don't understand Brexit. It's like, it's nothing to do with the economy. No single economic forecast has said that Brexit will be good for the British economy. It really is that simple. How could leaving your neighboring, and that's what all these fishermen are finding out. You sell fish, fresh fish, to your neighbors. You don't sell it to India or Australia. It's the same with a lot of produce, with a lot of goods in the world we live in. So it's not about economic things, it's about emotional things on both sides. And I think the European Union has to make a stronger emotional case for why it is fantastic to be part of the EU.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that we have to end at Obi. Yeah, we have. It's pity. It was very nice to hear you to have this talk. I think that I have some colleagues asking to translate your book into English. So it will be your next. Let's say task, or maybe adventure, linguistic adventure, because you like languages. I know that.
You could follow my Twitter feed, which is actually better than my book, and that's in English and in French.
Yes, if you want to join Alex on Twitter, please do that. I would like to thank all of you for having participated during the lunchtime. It's a very difficult time because some colleagues work hardly, and for the European Union, still we are working for this project, even it's not very, very easy. But I would like really to thank you. I would like to thank Obi and Dikra for technical assistance. Without you, we couldn't make this even happen. And I would like to thank my colleague, beloved colleague, Blandine, for the cooperation. And I think that we will do the next session. Maybe Alex we will introduce to the other topics linked to the European policies, and I think that you will accept it.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. See you next time. I don't know why, but it will be very, very soon. So please follow our website, our communication. And I think that today here in Brussels, we have sun. I wish you to have the
Here
sunny
too,
day and the
fine.
sunny year. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I have some.
Bye.